Hello and welcome to Chapter 3, which is a study of ecology. Ecology essentially is the study of organisms and the environment in which they live. In doing so, we look at how organisms interact with the other living things as well as the non-living parts of their environment. And any study can occur at multiple levels. So at the smallest level, you have one individual, such as one elk. If you were looking at a population, you would be looking at that same species as living as a group in one environment. A community level study would be looking at the collection of populations. So um, looking at the picture here, maybe you've got elk with bobcat, with owls, with bunnies, with the plants. So it's all of the living populations components. And then finally, the ecosystem would be one step larger, looking also at the non-living parts, the physical environment. And then biome would look at a collection of that type of environment. So for example, this forest ecosystem, if you were to look at all of the forest habitat in a larger area, maybe across North America, that would make up a biome. And then finally, the biosphere is the largest scale, and that's simply all of the living components within the planet. So looking within land, water, and air around the entire globe. Wherever you find life, that would be the biosphere. And so within an environment, there will be biotic factors as well as abiotic. Bio meaning living. Those are the things that are living within the environment. So that could be types of animals or plants or fungus or bacteria or protists. Abiotic factors would be all of the physical components, the non-living parts. So things like the air, the water, temperature, the soil components, the non-living parts. But in reality, an environment is definitely made up of both of those, and they certainly can influence one another. So, for example, a tree, which is definitely a biotic factor because it's living, has influence over abiotic factors, things like the amount of light that reaches the land there, the temperature range then because of the light that is limited. Trees also produce water vapor in the air, and so they control the amount of humidity, and also have the ability to change the chemical conditions of the soil, also abiotic. So in reality, environments are an interaction of both of the living and non-living things together. The study of ecology is trying to understand how all that works. In section 2 of chapter 3, we look at how the flow of materials and energy happens within an ecosystem. So we remember back to our study of photosynthesis and respiration, and you saw that the primary purpose of photosynthesis was to capture energy that then could be converted into forms that were usable. So we know that all living things need energy. That goes back to chapter 1 of the 8 characteristics of life, that the ability to obtain and use energy is critical. Those things that can capture energy from sunlight, for example, or even some chemical sources, we call producers or autotrophs. And these primary producers are the things that form the base of food chains and food webs in an ecosystem. So remember again the process of photosynthesis. We're taking in light, and then through different chemical reactions, we're converting that into a carbohydrate. And so carbon dioxide enters the plant from the environment, from the atmosphere, and then is converted into things like sugars or starches. Keep in mind that there are other things besides plants that do photosynthesis. There are certain types of bacteria, for example, that are able to do that as well. And although sunlight makes up the vast majority of the energy source on the planet, we have found thriving ecosystems in areas where there is no light. So think about deep sea environments, especially close to volcanic vents on the ocean floor where there's no light. there are chemicals that certain bacteria are able to use as an energy source. And instead of being photosynthesis, photo meaning light, we call that chemosynthesis, chemo meaning chemical energy. So at the base of all food chains and food webs, there has to be some kind of producer that captures energy, whether that's energy from the sun or energy from chemical components. The rest of the food chain is made up of consumers. These are things that can't produce their own food. Instead, they look to other organisms as a food source. And so different consumers are classified based on where they get their food. And so some examples would be carnivores or scavengers, decomposers, herbivores, omnivores, detritivores, for example. So whether animals are eating other animals, whether they're eating plants, whether they're scavenging for things that are already dead, or whether we're talking about bacteria or fungus that decompose dead organisms, all of these are types of consumers, which we call heterotrophs. And so when you start looking at the flow of energy and the flow of materials through this feeding relationship, you create a food chain. And so it's a series of steps where we're transferring energy as well as materials. And so, for example, this food chain shows the steps from the algae, which are the producers, the autotrophs, step by step to our top predator, the alligator. And each step in that food chain, there's energy transferred and there are materials transferred. In reality, though, ecosystems are much more complicated than a simple food chain. And so if you look at these orange arrows, they show that original food chain. But in reality, in this ecosystem, it's more complicated and there are many possible pathways for energy and materials to flow, many different feeding relationships. And so if you were to connect all of the possible food chains, you would construct something that looks like a web. And so this is called a food web, because it links all of those food chains together. It's important to note also that within a food chain or food web, the critical importance of decomposers and detritivores. So these are essentially the recyclers of the ecosystem. They are the things that are going to break down the organisms that have died, the material within that gets broken down, and then those nutrients are then returned to the ecosystem that then feed back into the producers. So those producers use those materials to begin that food pathway once again. And so without the decomposers and without the detritivores, that process wouldn't be able to continue. This is an example of how changes in the environment can have a ripple effect through an entire ecosystem. So food webs such as this one that are heavily dependent on one food source. So this food web is something that's heavily dependent on krill. You can imagine the effect that a krill population decline would have throughout the rest of this ecosystem because everything is tied back to that. And in recent years, krill populations have dropped pretty substantially. And so we've noticed in aquatic ecosystems like this one that there have been population declines of the other consumers as well. As we look at feeding relationships and the energy flow, we can construct ecological pyramids that show us the transfer of energy and also show us the relative amount of either energy or biomass or numbers of individuals within an ecosystem. All of these are called ecological pyramids. In a food chain, each level or link or step within the food chain is called a trophic level. And so this energy pyramid shows different trophic levels. At the base of the pyramid, you have your primary producers, so your plants, for example. The first level consumer, those are going to be the herbivores, things eating the plants. Second level consumers would be those things feeding on the herbivores. Third level consumers would be feeding on the second level. So those are the top predators. And as you go up in the food chain, you see that each level gets smaller and smaller. And so, although in theory there's no limit to the number of trophic levels in a food chain, in reality, food chains tend to be limited just simply because of energy availability. And so, what this energy pyramid shows us is that with each transfer, each step in the food chain, there's less and less energy available. So ultimately, going back to the amount of sunlight, for example, that was captured by those plants, that energy, a lot of that energy gets used by the plants themselves. And through those chemical reactions, a lot of the energy is lost as heat. So there's really only about 10% that is passed on to herbivores, and then 10% of that passed on to the second level consumers, and then again, only 10% available to that next level. So in reality, with food chains, we see that the amount of energy available at the next level is decreased substantially. And again, the reason for that decrease is that organisms need energy to fuel their bodies throughout their lifetime, and that's for chemical processes like respiration, for moving, for growing, for reproduction, and that all of those chemical processes involve energy transfer, and for most of them, heat is produced, and that heat is then lost to the environment. It's not available to be captured by the next organism in the food chain. In section 4, we look at how matter is recycled in an ecosystem. So we know that there's a constant new supply of energy as we continue to get a new supply of sunlight to the planet each day. However, the amount of matter, so the elements that make up our bodies, that make up the environment around us, that is a limited supply. So we never really get a new supply of matter, and instead we have to just recycle that we have. So the water cycle is a great example of this. We know that in the atmosphere there's a lot of water vapor, water molecules in a gas form, and that those gas molecules in the atmosphere get there through the process of evaporation, whether that's evaporating from a body of water like an ocean or a lake, or from evaporation that takes place through leaves of a plant. And that process of evaporation from leaves is called transpiration. And we know that that water vapor, when it starts to cool, begins to condense, and that condensation then forms clouds and then ultimately can lead to precipitation. Once the water falls back to the Earth's surface, it may land on the soil, which then remains on the surface and flows back into a body of water through runoff, or maybe it could actually be absorbed by the soil and percolate down. Once it's within the soil, it becomes part of the groundwater system, and that groundwater can then enter plants through their roots. It can flow into other bodies of water, or it can continue to percolate downward and become part of an aquifer, an underground reservoir of water that's available. And so if we remember back to your study of photosynthesis and respiration in your carbon project, we learned a lot about the carbon cycle. So this is another great example of how things just get recycled. So remember, again, the essence of the carbon cycle is that plants take in carbon dioxide for photosynthesis from the atmosphere, and then that carbon gets converted into a carbohydrate. Those carbohydrates then can get broken down again through respiration, or carbon that's stored can get decomposed once that organism dies, and then ultimately stores of carbon can be converted into rocks or fossil fuels. And when any of these carbon sources are broken down, they could be released back as CO2 into the atmosphere. The nitrogen cycle, another example of recycling in the environment. Nitrogen, obviously very important. It makes up a primary component of amino acids, which are used to build proteins, and nucleic acids, which we know are critical to the functioning of any living organism. And so nitrogen can be found in soils, in waste products of organisms, dead and decaying organic matter, and can be dissolved in several different forms in water. Nitrogen is the primary component of our atmosphere that makes up about 78%. And even though it's the primary component, it exists in a form that very few organisms can use directly. And so we rely on things like bacteria living in the soil and living in association with the roots of certain types of plants called legumes that then turn that into a form that's usable for the rest of the ecosystem. And one important note with the nitrogen cycle is that we as humans have the ability to greatly alter the nitrogen cycle. We add nitrogen in fertilizers. Nitrogen, it deposits onto the soil through the process of acid rain. And so we've, through both of those, have created excess nitrogen supply in our waterways through runoff, and that has caused a lot of disruption in especially aquatic ecosystems. The phosphorus cycle is another example of cycling within an ecosystem. Phosphorus, if you remember, is part of nucleic acids, so a primary component of DNA and RNA. It's not a very abundant element, however, and therefore can be kind of a limiting factor within an environment. So in general, the phosphorus usually exists in an inorganic form, which remains mostly on the land. And we would find that in the form of phosphates in rocks or soil minerals. And then as those rocks or minerals get worn down, phosphate is released, and some phosphate then stays on land and then can enter the food chain that way. As we look at the chemical components or nutrients in soil, we know that there are a few key components, and it's really important that all of those be present because they all work together in the chemical reactions that are involved in organisms. If there is one nutrient that is in short supply, we call that the limiting nutrient, and that can cause a ripple effect affecting the chemical processes of other nutrients. In general, we find that oceans tend to be fairly low in nitrogen, and again, the exception to that is where we've got areas of runoff from fertilizer or from acid rain deposition. In streams, lakes, freshwater environments, phosphorus is usually the limiting nutrient, but again, where we've got areas of excess runoff from phosphates through human use or products, then we might see artificially high levels of phosphorus. And so again, in areas where we do see those chemical usage and we see the runoff into waterways, this has a potential to really disrupt an ecosystem. So for example, the runoff would add a bunch of nutrients to the environment, and then that causes algae to sort of explode in their population numbers. That dramatic increase sounds like a good thing since algae is at the base of the food chain. However, that algae can't possibly get all consumed, and so once that algae dies, the decomposition of that by bacteria uses up all the oxygen, and what we find are huge fish kill events, for example, where the oxygen supply is depleted and then the other animals that rely on that oxygen don't have it. And so we've found areas that we call dead zones where the oxygen level is low because of this kind of surface runoff, where life really can't be supported any longer. And that concludes chapter 3, our introduction to the study of ecology.